The blizzard didn't fall so much as it hunted, erasing the road one breath at a time. In that white silence, an elderly couple leaned on each other, praying their bodies would last longer than the cold. They had one goal: reach help before a heart ran out of chances. A retired Navy SEAL named Ethan Crowe should have kept driving. He'd spent years training himself not to stop, not to hope, not to feel. But his German Shepherd, Rex, lifted his muzzle and caught a scent through the snow. Old pills, tired sweat, and refused to let Ethan pass. Headlights found two shadows. Ethan swore, hit the brakes, and chose mercy.
Cold.
Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. A Colorado mountain pass vanished under a screaming blizzard. Snow erased the lane lines and swallowed the trees, leaving only Ethan's headlights and the steady breath of a German Shepherd beside him in the cab. The truck was old enough to creak like a ship in rough water, but it kept moving, slow, stubborn, and familiar. Ethan liked machines that didn't pretend. You fed them fuel. You kept your hands steady. They did what they were built to do. People were messier. Rex sat upright in the passenger seat, shoulders square, eyes forward, the way he used to ride in warmer places where the air smelled like diesel and dust instead of pine and ice. A faint scar cut through the fur along his ribs. Ethan had stitched that wound under red light and incoming noise, telling the dog lies he hadn't believed himself. "You're fine. We're fine. Keep breathing." On the dash, tucked beside the defroster vent, lay a compact field stopwatch, the kind operators used to time things they didn't talk about. Ethan hadn't worn it in months. Still, he kept it close, like a charm that could hold the past in place if he pressed hard enough. The display was blank, dead battery or dead luck. Either way, it suited him. He drove with the radio off. Weather alerts didn't change weather. Warnings didn't bring back men. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice kept trying to form words. Marcus Dawson's voice, the last one Ethan had heard clearly before smoke swallowed the world. Don't let it turn you cold. That had been the message underneath everything, the part Ethan couldn't carry without feeling the weight of his own failure. The windshield wipers fought the snow and lost by inches. Wind hammered the truck's sides like an impatient fist. Ethan kept his jaw tight and his shoulders locked, as if posture alone could stop memory from climbing into the cab. Then Rex changed. It wasn't a bark at first. It was the stillness, the sudden tension in his spine, ears angled forward, nostrils flaring like he'd been hit by an invisible hand. A low sound rolled out of his throat, more warning than growl. Ethan leaned closer to the glass. "What is it?" Rex didn't look at him. He stared into the white, tracking something that didn't want to be seen. A second later, the headlights caught movement on the shoulder. Two figures, hunched and unsteady, stitched together by desperation. An old man with a cane sinking into drifted snow. A woman bracing him with both arms like she could borrow her own strength and pour it into his bones. Ethan's foot slammed the brake. The truck fishtailed, tires skittering on ice, then found a fragile grip. For a beat, the engine idled and the world narrowed to the two shapes in the light. No one walked this pass in a storm like this. Not unless they'd run out of options. Ethan yanked his door open and the wind punched him in the face, sharp as broken glass. Snow blasted into the cab. Rex jumped out behind him without being told, paws disappearing into the drift, body angled between Ethan and the strangers as if he could shield all of them at once. "Hey!" Ethan shouted. The word vanished into the gale. The couple froze. The old man turned first, blinking hard, mustache crusted with ice. His cheeks were raw, his shoulders shaking with the effort of standing upright. The woman's hood had slipped back, silver hair whipped across her face, and her lips had that bluish tint Ethan recognized from cold exposure videos they made rookies watch. "We're fine," the man rasped, voice stubborn even as his knees buckled a fraction. "Just trying to get down." "Down is miles," Ethan said, stepping closer, lowering his flashlight so it didn't blind them. "And you won't make it." The woman swallowed, eyes glossy with fear she was trying to hide. Her gloved hand clutched a small pouch to her chest. Canvas, worn, the kind of thing someone kept medicine in. "We didn't have a choice," she said. "His heart pills. They're gone. We thought maybe a car would pass." Ethan looked at the old man, looked at the trembling in his fingers, the shallow pattern of his breathing, the way his hand kept drifting toward his chest like it was remembering pain before it arrived. Training snapped into place inside Ethan's body with the ugly certainty of reflex. Rex stepped forward, calm and firm, nose pointed toward the pouch as if confirming what the woman said. Then he glanced up at Ethan, one quick look that carried the weight of a command. Ethan exhaled once, a thin cloud torn away by wind. "My name's Ethan," he said. "I've got a cabin up the ridge. Heat, blankets, food." "We don't want to trouble you," the man said, pride clinging like a last layer of clothing. "This isn't trouble," Ethan answered, voice sharper than he meant. He softened it just slightly. "This is survival." The woman's gaze flicked to Rex. Something in her expression eased, recognition of discipline, of safety earned through steadiness. She leaned closer to her husband, whispering a name like a plea. "Walter, please." Walter's shoulders sagged. Exhaustion finally outweighed dignity. He nodded once, small and defeated. Ethan opened the passenger side back door and gestured. "Get in. Now. Before your body decides for you." Rex circled them, guiding without touching, just presence and patience. Ethan helped Walter into the truck, careful of the cane and the stiff joints. The woman climbed in after him, still clutching the pouch like it contained their last hope. When Ethan shut the door, the wind's roar dulled. For a moment, the cab held 4 breaths, 2 shaky, 1 steady, 1 controlled. Ethan returned to the driver's seat and turned the wheel hard. The truck's nose swung back into the white. He told himself he was just getting them out of the storm. He didn't say the other truth out loud. He was driving back toward the one place he'd been avoiding, because in that cabin, the past didn't whisper. It spoke. By the time Ethan swung the truck around, Walter's breathing had turned ragged. Fear sharpened every sound inside the cab. Ethan cranked the heater to full and eased the pickup into the white inch by inch. The windshield fogged from their breath, and Ethan wiped a clear strip with his sleeve so he could keep the road's edge in sight. The storm tried to steal the world beyond the hood, but he drove the way he'd moved through streets overseas, slow enough to read danger, fast enough not to get buried by it. In the back seat, the woman, Evelyn, held Walter's forearm with both hands, rubbing warmth into him through wool and worn fabric. She spoke in a low stream of reassurances that sounded half like prayer, half like routine. Walter tried to answer her, but each word caught on a shallow inhale. Rex shifted off the floorboard and wedged himself closer to the back seat, head angled toward Walter's knees. Every few seconds he sniffed, then looked up at Ethan as if reporting silently, "Not good. Not yet lost. Move." Ethan's gaze flicked to the stopwatch on the dash. Dead. Useless. Still, he found himself tapping it once with his finger, a habit from another life, timing breaths, timing doors, timing the difference between rescue and recovery. His thumb hovered, wanting to press a button that didn't work. Static crackled from the truck's forgotten radio. Ethan hadn't turned it on. The storm must have shaken the dial loose, or the truck was simply tired of silence. A burst of garbled transmission cut through the noise. 3 words, then nothing. Anyone. Copy. Stuck. Ethan's hand tightened on the wheel. He turned the knob, trying to pull a clearer signal from the air, but the voice dissolved into hiss again. Somewhere out there, another person might be stranded. Another decision waiting. Ethan stared into the snow and told himself one problem at a time. The cabin appeared like a bruise in the blizzard. Dark shape, low roof line, nearly swallowed by drifts. Ethan pulled close to the porch, tires crunching into packed snow, and killed the engine. The sudden quiet made the storm sound even louder. He was out first, boots sinking, shoulders braced into wind. He opened the rear door and offered his arm. Evelyn took it with cold fingers that still moved with careful grace, like she'd spent a lifetime doing hard things without making a show of it. Walter tried to stand on his own. Pride rose up before strength did. His knees gave a warning tremble. "I've got you," Ethan said, catching him under the elbow. Walter's jaw clenched. "I can walk." "Good," Ethan answered. "Then walk with help." Rex bounded ahead, nose to the porch steps, then paused and looked back, watching their feet, tracking slick spots like he was mapping a route for them. Ethan guided Walter inside, one slow step at a time. The cabin smelled of old pine, dust, and disuse. Cold lived in the floorboards. The air had that dense, dead quality of a place that hadn't heard voices in too long. Ethan hadn't been here since last winter, and even then he'd stayed only long enough to grab supplies and leave before memory could settle on his shoulders. He eased Walter into a chair near the stone hearth. Evelyn hovered, hands fluttering, then knelt to pull off Walter's wet gloves. Rex laid down at Walter's feet, head on paws, eyes alert. Ethan moved like muscle memory. Kindling first, then larger wood. He struck a match and held it to the dry twigs until flame caught. The fire came alive with a reluctant crackle, then a steady glow that began pushing the cold back, inch by inch. On the far wall, above a shelf of chipped mugs, hung an old cabin clock. Its hands were frozen at 2:17, the second hand pinned in place like it had been shot mid-sentence. Ethan stared at it longer than he meant to. Time stopping had always felt familiar. He boiled water, tore open a packet of instant soup, and found a jar of honey that had crystallized into amber grit. The smell of warmth, salt, and herbs started to fill the room. Evelyn's shoulders loosened a fraction, the way a person does when their body finally believes it might live through the night. "You live here alone?" she asked softly, voice careful, as if loudness might break something. "Me and him," Ethan said, nodding toward Rex. Walter's eyes tracked Ethan's movements with the blunt assessment of someone who'd worn uniforms in another era. "You military," he said, not a question so much as a conclusion. "Used to be." Walter didn't press. Men who carried ghosts recognized the shape of silence. Ethan handed them steaming bowls, then draped a blanket over Walter's legs. Walter ate 2 bites and paused, swallowing with effort. His fingers shook. Evelyn barely touched her own food. She watched Walter instead, ready to steady him if the spoon slipped. As the heat seeped deeper into their bones, the storm outside softened to a steady roar against the windows. Ethan crouched by the hearth to adjust a log, and ash dusted his knuckles. When he stood, Evelyn's eyes were on his face in a strange, searching way. For a moment, her expression changed, softened into recognition that didn't belong in this room. "Rob," she whispered, voice thin as smoke. Ethan froze. The name hit him like a cold hand to the chest. He didn't answer fast enough. He didn't know how to. Walter's shoulders slumped in a way that said he'd been carrying that moment for years. "Evelyn," he murmured gently. "That's not—" Her brow furrowed. Confusion flickered, then embarrassment flushed her cheeks. "Oh, my. I'm sorry," she said quickly, pressing a hand to her mouth. "I don't know why I—" "It's fine," Ethan said, forcing his voice steady. "You're tired." Walter's gaze lifted to Ethan's, apologetic and exhausted. "It happens," he said quietly. "Doctor calls it mild. Comes and goes." Ethan nodded once. He felt the dead stopwatch on the dash like a weight, as if time itself had paused to watch how he handled the fragile truth in front of him. Outside, wind hurled snow against the glass. Inside, the clock stayed frozen. Then Rex's head snapped up. His ears pricked toward the door. A low warning sound rolled in his chest. Controlled, precise, the sound of a partner who sensed something before you did. Ethan set his bowl down and listened. Over the fire's crackle and the storm's grind, a new sound threaded in, faint, irregular. A thump, then another, like someone, touching the porch from the other side of the blizzard. The thumping on the porch came again, closer this time, followed by a deep, complaining creak from the cabin's bones. Ethan felt the old, familiar spike of adrenaline claw up his ribs, the kind that never asked permission. He grabbed his flashlight and nodded once to Rex. Rex was already moving, silent paws finding the floorboards as Ethan crossed to the door. When he opened it, the storm punched in, but not with the force of before. The wind had shifted, still angry but tired. Snow hissed sideways under the porch light. Ethan swept the beam across the steps. Nothing living stared back. Then he saw it. A thick slab of snow had slid off the roof and smashed onto the porch, collapsing part of a drift into the railing. The impact had slapped the boards like a fist. The roof line sagged just enough to make Ethan's stomach tighten. Barely noticeable to anyone else, but obvious to a man who'd learned to read structures the way he read faces. "Okay," he murmured, more to himself than the dog. Rex sniffed the fallen snow, then looked up, ears forward, waiting for the next instruction. Ethan stepped out, boots sinking, and inspected the eaves with the flashlight. Ice clung to the gutters in fat, jagged teeth. If more weight shifted, the roof could bow further. Not tonight, he told himself. Not while 3 people depended on these walls. He knocked the drift loose where he could, working fast with gloved hands until his fingers numbed. The wind tugged at his collar like it wanted him back out into the white. When he turned to go in, Rex paused at the edge of the porch and stared into the storm, nose high again. Ethan followed the direction of his gaze. Only snow. Only darkness. Still, that old radio transmission scratched at Ethan's thoughts. Anyone. Copy. Stuck. As if the mountain itself was full of voices trying to reach someone. Inside, warmth hit him like relief he didn't deserve. The fire had settled into a steady glow. Evelyn slept on the couch under a blanket, her mouth slightly open, breathing shallow but calmer. Walter dozed in the chair, head tipped to one side, one hand resting over his chest like a guard that had fallen asleep at its post. Ethan crouched by the hearth and fed the flame a small log. The cabin clock above the mugs remained frozen at 2:17, unmoved by heat or time or mercy. He caught himself staring at it again, then forced his eyes away. Rex circled once and lay down near Walter's feet, chin on paws, the picture of calm. Ethan stayed awake a while longer, listening to the storm grind itself down, listening to Walter's breath for any change. Morning arrived like a muted apology. The blizzard didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip. Light leaked through the frosted windows in pale bands, painting the room in cold gold. Ethan sat on the edge of a chair with a mug of bitter coffee, watching steam rise and disappear. Evelyn woke slowly, blinking like she'd surfaced from deep water. For a moment her eyes searched the room, uncertain. Then she saw Ethan and flinched with remembered embarrassment. "Mr. Crowe," she said, voice hoarse. "About last night. I'm so sorry." "It's fine," Ethan answered, because it was easier than saying it wasn't. "How are you feeling?" She pressed her fingers to her forehead as if checking for a missing thought. "Tired," she admitted, "but clearer." Walter stirred at the sound of her voice, opening one eye. "Told you he'd still be here," he rasped, then coughed, a dry, scraping sound that made Ethan's attention sharpen. Ethan set the mug down. "Any chest pain?" Walter shifted, stubborn as ever. "Just tight. Happens when I get cold." Evelyn reached for a small canvas pouch on the coffee table, the one she'd clutched in the storm, and held it out with both hands like an offering. "This is why we walked," she said softly. "It was supposed to be full." Ethan took it and opened the zipper. Inside was an empty pill bottle, label smeared from snowmelt, and a folded scrap of paper with neat handwriting. Dosage times, circled with one word underlined twice, "Don't skip." Tucked behind it was a photograph, edges curled and damp. A young woman in a knit hat, smiling into winter sunlight, arms looped around an older couple who looked younger but unmistakably the same. Evelyn's fingers hovered over the photo like she was afraid the memory might tear. "Our granddaughter," she whispered. "Lila. She's in college down valley. We didn't want to worry her." Walter's mouth twitched. "We figured we'd get the refill and be back before anyone noticed." Ethan's gaze went to the window. The world outside still looked like it could kill you for being careless. And the phone. "Line went dead the first night the wind came," Walter said. "We waited 2 days. Then Evelyn, she packed the pouch and said we were going." Evelyn lifted her chin, quiet defiance in her tired face. He was getting worse. Waiting wasn't an option. Ethan didn't argue. He understood that kind of decision, the one made in fear, disguised as courage. He heated water and made oatmeal because it was what he had. While they ate, Rex sat near Evelyn's feet, accepting a gentle scratch behind the ears with dignified patience. For the first time that morning, Evelyn smiled. "You're a good boy," she told him. "You saved us." Rex blinked slow as if he'd heard it all before. When the bowls were empty, Ethan checked his pantry like a man counting bullets. Canned beans, soup, a few packets of instant coffee, bandages, no heart medication, no miracles. He turned the radio on. Static filled the cabin, loud in the morning quiet. Ethan adjusted the dial, coaxing the air, searching for a voice. For a few seconds he caught a thread. County, search, pass closed. Then it broke apart again into hiss. He wrote the fragments on the back of a grocery receipt with a dull pencil, the way he used to log coordinates that mattered. Evelyn watched him with a worried stillness. "Someone's looking." "They will be," Ethan said, because pretending otherwise felt cruel. Rex rose and padded toward a weathered leather suitcase near Walter's chair. He sniffed it, tail still, then gave a small, insistent whine. Walter followed the dog's attention, then nodded once. "Go ahead," he said quietly. "It's old things." Ethan unlatched the case. Inside were bundles of letters tied with faded blue ribbon, a small journal with a cracked spine, and a black and white photo of a young sailor in uniform, arm around a laughing woman whose eyes looked like Evelyn's before time softened them. Ethan lifted the top letter carefully. The paper was thin, but the handwriting was steady, controlled, like someone who'd learned to keep emotion inside the lines. He read the first sentence, and something tightened behind his ribs. It wasn't about war. It was about a promise, about finding someone in a storm when the world turned cruel. Ethan closed the letter gently, as if it could break. He looked at Walter, who stared into the fire like he could see 50 years back in the flame. Before Ethan could speak, a sharp crack sounded overhead. Dust drifted down from the ceiling beam. The cabin clock stayed frozen. The roof gave a slow, ominous groan, like it was deciding whether it could keep holding on. Ethan tilted his head up, listening. Rex's ears pricked. Evelyn's hand found Walter's, and Ethan realized the storm wasn't finished asking for payment. The roof's groan forced a decision. Fix it now, or gamble the cabin won't collapse before help arrives. Ethan felt the old panic he usually outran, but he swallowed it. He grabbed his coat, a coil of rope, and a hammer from the supply bin. Outside, daylight looked harmless until it hit your face. Cold snapped at Ethan's cheeks as he stepped onto the porch and studied the roofline. A thick ridge of snow had drifted into the valley of the shingles, piling where the wind liked to dump its weight. The beam had flexed under it, just enough to complain, not enough to fail. Yet. Walter came to the doorway, wrapped in a blanket like a stubborn king. "You're thinking what I'm thinking," he rasped. "That it's about to come down?" Ethan said. "That it won't, if we stop treating it like it's someone else's problem." Walter lifted his chin. "You got a ladder?" Ethan glanced at the old aluminum ladder buried half in drift. "Yeah." Walter nodded once, then coughed. "Then you got help." Evelyn appeared behind him, eyes widening when she saw the ladder. "Walter, you are not." "I'm not dying on a porch," he cut in gently, then softened as he looked back at her. "And I'm not letting this young man do it alone." Ethan didn't call himself young, but the word landed anyway, like a reminder that someone still saw him as a person, not just a set of skills. He looked at Evelyn. "He stays on the lower slope," Ethan promised. "You keep the fire going. Keep him warm between passes." Evelyn's mouth tightened with worry, but she nodded. Love didn't always look like permission. Sometimes it looked like surrendering control to keep someone alive. Ethan ran rope around a porch post and tied a quick, practiced knot. Then he looped the other end around Walter's waist in a makeshift safety line. Walter watched, impressed despite himself. "Boy Scout?" Walter asked. "Different club," Ethan said. Walter's eyes flicked to Ethan's hands. Scarred, steady, fast. "Yeah," he murmured. "I figured." They climbed carefully. Ethan went first, boots finding purchase on icy shingles. Walter followed with deliberate steps that didn't match his age so much as his attitude. He moved like a man who'd spent years on something higher than a porch roof. Rigging, ladders, ship rails, places where you learn to trust your balance or pay for it. Ethan shoveled snow with a flat spade, pushing it down in controlled sheets so it wouldn't avalanche onto the porch. Walter knelt near the ridge and began chipping ice free from the gutter with the patience of a craftsman. Every strike was economical. No wasted energy, no drama. "You've done this before," Ethan said over the wind. Walter snorted. "I built boats for 20 years after the Navy. Wood, metal, stubborn men. It's all the same. You ignore stress long enough, something snaps." He paused and pressed a gloved hand to his chest, breathing through the tightness. "Besides, storms don't scare me. It's what storms leave behind that does." Ethan kept shoveling, but the words hooked into him. He knew what storms left behind. He wore it in the way he couldn't sit still, in the way silence turned into a weapon when you let it. A gust hit them, hard enough to make the ladder rattle. Ethan reflexively steadied Walter with one hand. Walter looked at him, brief, sharp. "You ever get tired of always catching people?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I got tired of not catching one." Walter didn't ask who. He didn't need to. Men carried loss in the same places. Behind the eyes, under the ribs. Walter tapped his cane handle against the shingles as if punctuating a thought. "You don't stop hearing them," he said, voice rough with cold. "You just learn how to live without letting the echoes steer." Ethan pushed another load of snow off the edge. Easy to say. Walter's gaze drifted across the pass, where the world was all white and distance. "I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying it's possible." He took a careful breath. "After the Pacific, I came home and tried to sit still. Thought I'd earned it. Nearly broke me. So I worked, fixed what I could touch. When my hands were busy, my head stopped trying to eat itself." Ethan swallowed, feeling something shift. Small, unwanted, honest. "So what?" he said quietly. "You just keep fixing things until it hurts less?" Walter smiled without humor. "You keep fixing things until you remember you're not broken beyond repair." They finished clearing the heaviest drift. Ethan checked the sag again. Less bent now, the roof exhaling as weight lifted. He drove a handful of nails into a loosened shingle seam near the ridge, sealing a gap where meltwater had started to creep. Walter leaned closer, inspecting the line like a foreman. "Not bad," Walter admitted, "for an ocean boy who ended up in the mountains." Ethan almost laughed. The sound surprised him, like it belonged to somebody else. Below them, Rex barked once from the yard, short, sharp, controlled. Ethan looked down and saw the shepherd pacing near the tree line, nose low, tail stiff with focus. "What's he got?" Walter asked. "Rex doesn't bark like that for squirrels," Ethan said. They climbed down slower than they'd gone up. Walter's breathing was heavier now, and Evelyn rushed out to guide him inside, fussing with the blanket like it was a shield she could raise against everything. While Walter sat by the fire to recover, Ethan crossed to the wall clock above the mugs. It still read 2:17. Hands locked, stubborn as Walter, frozen as the part of Ethan that refused to move forward. Walter caught Ethan staring. That clock been dead long. Since I came back, Ethan said. Maybe longer. Walter pushed himself up with a grunt and shuffled over. Bring it down. Ethan hesitated, then lifted it off the nail and placed it on the table. Walter opened the back with a small pocket tool, fingers suddenly sure. He blew dust from the gears, then adjusted a tiny spring with a delicacy that didn't match his rough hands. Evelyn watched, eyes softening. He can't help himself, she said to Ethan, half apology, half pride. Walter sees something broken and takes it personally. Walter grunted. If it's fixable, it deserves a chance. Ethan's gaze flicked to the dead-field stopwatch on the dash. He didn't say anything, but he felt the comparison like a quiet bruise. Walter turned the clock's key and listened. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, one faint click. Another. The second hand twitched forward as if waking from a long sleep. Tick. Tick. The sound spread through the cabin, small but undeniable. Evelyn let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Rex lifted his head and blinked, ears twitching as if the rhythm had changed the air itself. Walter set the clock back on the wall. There, he said, satisfied. Time's moving again, whether you like it or not. Ethan stared at the clock, and something in his chest answered the ticking, an uneasy recognition that life kept going, and maybe he could too. He reached up and tapped the dead stopwatch on the dash with his knuckle, just once, still blank, still silent. But the cabin had a pulse now. Then Rex sprang up with a low, urgent sound and trotted to the window. Snow had thinned enough to see movement beyond the porch. Nothing dramatic, just the clean stretch of white and the dark edge of pines. Rex barked again and pawed at the door. Ethan opened it, and Rex shot out, following a line only he could read. Ethan stepped onto the porch and scanned the yard. There, near the tree line, were prints that weren't theirs. Fresh depressions half-filled by drifting snow, leading away from the cabin in a staggered path. Not animal, too narrow, too purposeful. Ethan's throat tightened. The radio's broken voice echoed in his head. Stuck. Copy. Rex looked back at him, eyes bright, body angled toward the woods like an arrow. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and the rope again. Stay with Walter, he told Evelyn, voice already shifting into mission. Keep the fire high. Evelyn's face paled. Ethan. I'll be quick, he said, though he didn't believe it. He stepped into the snow after Rex, following the chuging prints toward the pines, toward whatever the storm had decided to hide next. The fresh tracks didn't just suggest danger, they confirmed it. Someone had been close enough to Ethan's cabin to leave prints in the drift. A cold unease slid under Ethan's ribs, familiar and sharp. He tightened his grip on the rope and followed Rex into the trees. Snow softened as the pines thickened, muffling the wind into a lower, angrier hiss. Rex moved ahead with purpose, nose skimming the surface, tail stiff, then swinging once when he caught the line again. Ethan stayed a few yards behind, scanning left and right, counting steps the way he used to count corners. The prints weren't clean. Whoever made them had stumbled, heel-dragging, toe-digging, then a sudden gap where they'd fallen and pushed themselves up again. Ethan crouched and touched the depression with a gloved hand. Not frozen solid yet. Fresh. A gust snapped through the branches overhead, shaking loose powder that dusted his shoulders. Ethan paused, listening. Nothing but wind and Rex's steady breathing. He remembered the radio's broken phrase, stuck, copy, and felt his pulse shift into that old operational tempo. People didn't wander this mountain in weather like this unless the mountain gave them no choice. Rex stopped at a leaning spruce and looked back, eyes bright, ears forward. "What?" Ethan whispered. Rex snorted, then pushed through a thicket where the snow was deeper, forcing Ethan to lift his knees high with each step. The rope dragged behind him like a lifeline to the cabin, to the fire, to the two fragile breaths waiting for him to come back. The trees opened into a small clearing, no wider than a backyard, where the snow lay smoother, less churned by wind. At the far edge stood something dark and crooked, half swallowed by years. A low, wooden structure with a sagging roof, its door hanging open like a mouth that couldn't close. Rex trotted straight toward it, then slowed, circling, sniffing the threshold. Ethan's chest tightened with recognition he couldn't place. The shape of it, the way it sat in the clearing like it belonged there, like it had always been there, waiting. He stepped closer and ran his flashlight beam along the outer wall. A hand-carved symbol stared back at him from the wood. Faded but unmistakable. A simple C inside a triangle. The lines cut with patience, not haste. Ethan's throat went dry. His father had carved that mark on fence posts, tool handles, even the underside of the porch rail when Ethan was a kid, like leaving a signature the world didn't need. But he did. Dad, Ethan breathed, the word thin in the cold. Rex gave a quiet huff and nudged the door, pushing it wider. Ethan entered carefully. The air inside smelled like old pine sap and mouse nests and thyme. A workbench hugged the back wall, and above it hung a rusted lantern and a first-aid tin with flaking paint. Snow had drifted in through cracks, piling in soft crescents on the floor, but it wasn't empty. On the bench sat a battered metal box, sealed, military surplus style, with a latch that had been oiled enough times to keep moving. Ethan stepped closer, heart thudding. He opened it. Inside were neatly stacked supplies, thermal blankets in vacuum packs, a roll of gauze, a small tourniquet, iodine wipes, protein bars hard as bricks, and an emergency flare sealed in plastic. Not new, but not ruined. Someone had maintained this, or built it well enough that the mountain hadn't taken it yet. Ethan stared, stunned by the simple competence of it. This wasn't a random hunter's stash. This was a cache, planned, labeled, meant for strangers. Rex sniffed the box, then turned his head sharply toward the corner near the door and let out a low, insistent sound. Ethan followed the dog's gaze and saw a narrow strip of canvas half buried in snow. He knelt and pulled it free. It was a map pouch, weathered and stiff, with a snapped buckle. Inside, a folded topographic map, edges curled, ink faded but readable. A line had been drawn by hand, dark pencil, steady pressure, connecting the upper ridge to the valley road in a looping, safer descent. Along the route were tiny notes: wind cut, ice shelf, shelter, radio line. At one point someone had written, "If you're here, keep going." Ethan swallowed hard. The handwriting wasn't his. It was his father's. Same blocky capitals. Same habit of underlining twice when something mattered. He stood there for a long moment, breathing slow, letting the meaning settle in. His father hadn't just built a cabin for himself. He'd built a way through the mountain for people who ran out of luck. A route, a system, a promise carved into wood and paper instead of spoken out loud. Outside, the wind moaned through the clearing like it resented the idea of help existing at all. Ethan stepped back into the doorway and scanned the snow again. Rex was already at the far side of the shed, nose down, following something. The prints. They didn't lead into the shed. They led past it, angled toward a stand of pines where the ground sloped away. Ethan moved with Rex, boots crunching, breath tight. The tracks grew messier here, deeper drags, more pauses. Then, near a fallen log, Ethan saw a dark shape in the snow. A knit cap. Ethan crouched and lifted it, still slightly damp with sweat. Human sweat. His stomach clenched. "Hey," he called, voice thrown into the trees. "If you're out here, answer me." Nothing came back, just the wind and Rex's steady searching. Ethan forced himself to think. If someone was injured, they might have crawled under cover. If they were hypothermic, they might be confused. moving in circles, chasing warmth that wasn't there. Rex stopped again near a small dip in the ground, tail lowering. He sniffed, then pawed once. Ethan stepped closer and saw a shallow depression where the snow had been disturbed, like someone had sat, then slid down, then pulled themselves forward. But the trail beyond was faint, half erased. Ethan's pulse hammered. He glanced at the sky. Light was thinning already, swallowed by cloud. The storm wasn't done, not even close. He looked back toward the shed and made a choice that felt like swallowing steel. He couldn't chase a fading trail deep into the trees without risking getting lost himself. Not with Walter's heart hanging by a thread back at the cabin. Not with Evelyn relying on him to return. One rescue could become 4 bodies in the snow. Ethan clipped the rope to a nearby trunk to mark the direction, then yanked the metal box off the bench and slung the map pouch over his shoulder. He turned to Rex, voice firm. "Back." Rex hesitated, one last sniff toward the trees, then obeyed, falling into step at Ethan's knee, ears still tuned for anything that didn't belong. As they moved out of the clearing, Ethan glanced once more at his father's carved symbol on the shed wall. It looked like a quiet oath left behind for him to find. "This is how you keep people alive," it seemed to say. "You leave light where you can." Ethan didn't know who those prints belonged to yet, but he knew one thing with certainty. His father had built a way out of the mountain, and Ethan was finally ready to use it. Ethan came back to the cabin with a metal cash box under one arm and a map pouch slung over his shoulder. The uneasy feeling that someone was still out there rode in with him, sharp and unfinished. He set the box on the table and went straight to Walter, watching the old man's chest rise and fall. Walter was awake, but only halfway, eyes open, mind drifting. The firelight painted his face in tired bronze, and the ticking clock on the wall sounded louder than it should have, like the cabin was insisting on being alive. Evelyn stood from the couch the moment she saw Ethan. Relief flashed across her features, then tightened into worry when she noticed his expression. "You found something," she said. "Yeah," Ethan answered. "Not what I hoped." Rex padded in behind him, snow crusted along his legs. He shook once, then sat near Walter's chair like a sentry returning to post. Ethan placed the knit cap on the table. It looked innocent there. Soft, ordinary, the kind of thing that didn't belong to a storm trying to kill people. He turned it over, thumb brushing the inside seam. A stitched tag caught the light. Silverton Sar. Evelyn leaned in. "Search and rescue?" Ethan nodded, jaw tight. "Someone from Down Valley's been up here. Recently." Walter's voice rasped from the chair. "Or someone got sent up here." Ethan opened the cash box. Thermal blankets, gauze, flares, a few ration bars. Supplies his father had packed with the kind of quiet care that assumed strangers mattered. Ethan set a blanket near Walter's legs and tucked it in, then placed the map pouch beside the radio. "I found a route," he said, "an old descent line, safer than the main pass, marked by hand." Walter's eyes sharpened at that, the way a craftsman's focus woke up when work appeared. "Your father." Ethan didn't trust his voice at first. He just nodded. Evelyn's gaze moved from the supplies to the ticking clock on the wall, then back to Ethan. "You're carrying him around in your hands," she said softly. Ethan pretended he didn't hear the tenderness in that. He crouched by the stove and adjusted the kettle. While it heated, he checked Walter again, 2 fingers at the carotid, watching the pulse in the old man's throat. It was there. Weak, but steady enough to make Ethan exhale. "Any pain?" Ethan asked. Walter swallowed, grimacing. "Feels like someone's sitting on me." Ethan reached into the first aid drawer and found aspirin, then hesitated. "Allergies?" Walter shook his head. Evelyn's hands trembled as Ethan placed the pills in her palm and poured water. She guided Walter through it like she'd done 100 times before. When the immediate crisis settled into a quiet, Ethan turned back to the fire. He pulled on a glove and opened the ash drawer beneath the hearth to clear it, an old habit from when he stayed here as a kid, his father teaching him what kept a home warm. As the drawer slid out, something pale fluttered against the black dust. Paper. Not fresh, not clean. Brittle fragments with charred edges, curled like dead leaves. Ethan froze, heartbeat jumping. He eased the drawer farther out and saw more. Several half-burned sheets wedged behind the iron lip, as if they'd been shoved there and forgotten. The smell wasn't just smoke, it was old ink, half-preserved by ash and time. Evelyn noticed his stillness. "Ethan?" He lifted one fragment carefully, like it might crumble into nothing if he breathed wrong. The handwriting on it was delicate, looped and slanted, a woman's hand trained to make beauty out of shortage. His throat tightened before he read a single word, because the line at the top wasn't addressed to him. It was addressed to Robert. Ethan's fingers went numb. He stared as if the name could rewrite itself into something safer. Walter shifted in the chair, sensing the change. "What is it?" he asked. Ethan swallowed. "My father's name." Evelyn stepped closer, hand rising to her mouth. "Oh, honey." Ethan pulled another piece free, then another, until he had 3 fragments laid on the hearthstone like evidence. The middle page was the most intact. He read silently for a second. Then his vision blurred. Anger and grief and something worse, something like understanding. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't accusations. They were small, tired truths written by someone who kept the light on and the house quiet and waited for a man who stayed gone. Ethan's voice came out rough. "She wrote these. My mom." Walter's gaze dropped to the fragments with the solemn respect of a man who'd spent years writing letters because it was the only way to keep love from evaporating. Why were they in the ash drawer? Ethan looked at the blackened edges. Because somebody tried to burn them. Silence thickened. The fire crackled, almost embarrassed to be alive while those pages died. Ethan's mind shoved him backward in time. His father in this cabin, alone, shoulders bent, feeding paper into flame like he was trying to erase a life he couldn't fix. Ethan saw it with sudden clarity. Not cruelty, not contempt. Something closer to shame. Or surrender. Evelyn knelt beside the hearth. "Sometimes people burn what hurts," she whispered. "Not because they don't love it. Because they don't know where to put it." Ethan stared at the fragments, jaw clenched so hard it hurt. He was always helping someone. Always one more rescue, one more trip, one more night. His voice cracked on the last word. "I used to think he chose strangers over us." Walter's eyes stayed steady. Maybe he didn't think he deserved to come home and be ordinary. The sentence hit Ethan like a blunt object. He thought of himself driving aimlessly through storms just to keep moving. Thought of the dead stopwatch on his dash. Thought of how stopping felt like drowning. Evelyn picked up one fragment and squinted, lips moving silently as she pieced words together. Her hands shook, but her voice, when she spoke, was clear and gentle, as if she were reading over a sleeping child. She says, "If you're out there in the white again, I hope someone finds you before the cold does." Ethan's eyes burned. He stared into the flames because looking at Evelyn felt too much like being seen. Walter let out a slow breath. "That's not anger," he murmured. "That's love. Scared out of its skin." Ethan's fingers curled into his palm, nails biting through glove. "Then why burn it?" Evelyn's gaze softened in a way that made Ethan's chest hurt. "Maybe he read them," she said, "and he couldn't stand what they proved, that he was needed in places he didn't know how to be needed." Ethan looked down at the ash on his glove. He pictured his mother by a window somewhere, writing to a man who kept saving the world because saving the world was simpler than saving a marriage. The cabin clock ticked on the wall, steady and indifferent. Ethan reached into his coat and pulled out the field stopwatch. Dead screen. Dead silence. He held it over the fragments, then set it on the hearthstone beside them like an offering. "I keep trying to stop time," he said quietly. Like if it doesn't move, nothing can get worse. Walter's voice rasped, but it carried weight. Time moves anyway, son. The question is whether you move with it, or let it drag you. Ethan stared at the letters, then at the fire. He didn't want to destroy the last pieces of his mother's voice. He also didn't want to live with them as a weapon. He needed something different than revenge against the past. He chose one fragment, the smallest, the one with only a few lines still legible. He folded it carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat near his heart, where it could exist without dominating him. Then, with a breath that felt like swallowing glass, he lifted the remaining pieces and set them back into the flames. The paper curled. Ink darkened. The fire took what was left, not with cruelty, but with finality. Ethan watched until the last edge became ash. Evelyn's hand settled on his wrist, light, steady. "You didn't erase her," she said. "You let her rest." Ethan didn't answer. He wasn't sure he could. Rex nudged Ethan's boot, then sat again, calm as if he approved of the choice. Outside, the wind shifted. For a moment, the storm quieted enough that Ethan could hear something else. Faint, distant, mechanical. An engine. Ethan's head snapped toward the window. Through the thinning snow, a weak yellow beam flickered between the trees, headlights crawling uphill like a stubborn animal refusing to die. Rex rose instantly, ears forward, body rigid. Walter's eyes widened. Someone made it up here. Evelyn's voice trembled. Family. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and moved to the door, pulse thudding with a new kind of fear. Hope mixed with danger. "Only one way to find out," he said, and stepped onto the porch as the sound of tires crunching over ice grew louder. Headlights climbed through the trees, and the cabin stopped feeling like the last dot of warmth on the mountain. Hope flared in Ethan's chest, then immediately tightened into caution. He stepped onto the porch with Rex at his knee, flashlight raised. The beam caught a county utility snowmobile grinding into the drive, its single headlamp wobbling in the wind. A man climbed off, late 40s, broad shoulders, face wind-chapped and patient, the kind of tired that came from responsibility, not sleep deprivation. A laminated badge swung from his neck on a cord, half hidden by his parka. "Ethan Crowe," the man called, voice firm but not hostile. Ethan didn't lower the light yet. "Who's asking?" "County Search Coordinator," the man said, and held up a gloved hand to show he wasn't reaching for anything. "Name's Mason Hale, Silverton side. We've been combing the pass since the first warning went out." Rex stood still, ears forward, assessing. Not growling, just reading. Mason's eyes flicked once to the dog, respectful, quick. "That shepherd yours?" "Yeah. Trained. Enough." Mason nodded like that answered more than the word. Then his gaze slid past Ethan's shoulder to the cabin window where firelight glowed. "You got two elderly folks inside?" Ethan's jaw worked once. "Walter and Evelyn." Mason let out a breath that fogged his beard. Thank God. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small handheld radio and a satellite messenger device, both scuffed like they'd been dropped in snow more than once. "Their granddaughter's been calling every station within 100 miles. We had units on both ends of the pass. Roads went from bad to impossible overnight." Ethan motioned him toward the door. "Come in." "Fast?" The moment Mason stepped inside, the warmth hit him and he looked briefly guilty, like he'd forgotten heat existed. His eyes took in Walter by the chair, Evelyn near the couch, the ticking wall clock, the supplies laid out on the table. He nodded once at Evelyn, the way you do when you're trying not to startle someone already frayed. Evelyn rose, hands clasped tight. "They're looking for us?" "Yes, ma'am," Mason said gently. "Your family's safe. They're scared, but they're safe." Walter tried to push himself up. Pride made the first move, his body argued. Ethan was already beside him, palm on his shoulder, steadying him back down. Mason crouched to Walter's level, voice low. "Sir, I need you to stay seated. Can you breathe okay?" Walter managed a thin smile. "I've had worse mornings." Mason's expression tightened with professional concern. "Any chest pain right now?" Walter hesitated, then gave a small nod. Mason immediately unzipped his pack and pulled out a compact medical kit. Not full EMS gear, but enough to keep someone alive until the mountain stopped trying to kill them. He offered a finger pulse ox clip and checked Walter's fingertips, then glanced at Ethan. "You got nitro?" Mason asked. Ethan shook his head. "Empty bottle, that's why they walked." Mason's mouth set hard, not at Ethan, at the situation. "Okay. Aspirin already?" "Yeah." Mason nodded. "Good." He pulled out a small oxygen canister, portable, limited, and fitted the mask to Walter with practiced hands. "Slow breaths. In through your nose if you can. Don't fight it." Walter grumbled but obeyed. Evelyn's eyes shone with relief so sharp it looked like pain. "Thank you," she whispered. Mason turned the radio on low and stepped toward the window, angling the antenna. Static hissed. A clipped voice broke through, then warped. Mason adjusted again. Ethan watched him and felt the old readiness creep into his limbs, waiting for the briefing, the problem, the next move. Mason finally caught a clearer burst and his face darkened. He killed the volume and looked back at Ethan. "We've got a bigger issue," Mason said. Ethan's chest tightened. "What?" "Landslide on the south switchbacks," Mason answered, precise. "Happened overnight. Took half the roadbed. Trees down across the north stretch, too. Even if the storm quit right now, we can't drive an ambulance through for days." Evelyn swayed slightly, like the floor had shifted under her. "Days?" Mason's voice softened. "We're bringing in a crew, but this mountain doesn't move because we ask nicely." Ethan's mind jumped ahead. Walter's weak pulse, no meds, no guaranteed clear window. Waiting wasn't a plan. Waiting was a gamble. Mason's eyes narrowed, studying Ethan. "You got an alternate route?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He crossed to the table, grabbed the map pouch, and unfolded the topographic sheet. The hand-drawn line looked darker in daylight, more intentional. He tapped the penciled path with a knuckle. "My father," Ethan said. "He built a descent route years ago, marked shelters, wind cuts, ice shelves. It drops into the valley road just above the ranger station." Mason leaned in, reading the notes. His brows lifted. "This is legit." "It's real," Ethan said. "I found the cache shed." Mason let out a low whistle, half impressed, half worried. "If this route still holds, it's your best chance, but it's narrow. One wrong step on an ice shelf and you're not walking out." Walter shifted under the oxygen mask, eyes sharper than his body. "Then we don't take wrong steps," he rasped. Evelyn's hand found Walter's. "Walter!" Walter squeezed back stubborn tenderness. "I'm not dying in a chair waiting for a road to forgive me." Mason looked between them, then back to Ethan. "We can stage a meet point," he said. "I can get a team up to the lower trailhead with a sled once the wind drops, but we need timing." Ethan's gaze went to the wall clock, ticking steady, then to the dead field stopwatch on the dash, silent, stubborn. He reached into the cash box, dug through supplies, and found a blister pack of coin batteries taped to a flare pouch like someone had planned for everything. Ethan's throat tightened. "Of course," he murmured. He popped the stopwatch open with a small knife, slid the battery in, and snapped it shut. The screen blinked alive, 000. For a second, Ethan just stared, as if he didn't trust time to start again. Then he pressed start. The digits began to move. Mason watched that, and something in his expression shifted. Recognition, maybe. "You SEALs love your timers," he said quietly. Ethan didn't smile. "Timers don't care how you feel. They just tell the truth." Mason nodded once. "All right, here's the truth. We wait for a lull. You take the route. I'll relay your progress every 30 minutes. If you miss 2 check-ins, we come looking." He set the radio on the table and scribbled coordinates on the back of a weathered card. "This is the meet point. If you reach it, you'll see flares. Green, not red." Evelyn exhaled shakily. "When do we go?" Ethan looked out the window at the thinning snow, then at Walter's pale face, then down at the fragment of his mother's letter tucked against his heart. "First break in the wind," Ethan said. "We don't waste it." Rex rose and walked to the door as if he'd already accepted the plan. Outside, the storm didn't stop. But for the first time, Ethan wasn't waiting for permission to live through it. The moment the wind eased, consequences arrived first. Silence. Not peace, just a thin gap in the storm big enough to move through. Ethan felt it in the trees, in the way the snow stopped screaming and started falling straight. He checked Walter's breathing, then looked at Evelyn. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She'd already wrapped scarves, tightened gloves, and layered every piece of warmth the cabin could spare. She moved like a woman who'd learned long ago that fear didn't excuse you from doing what had to be done. Ethan clipped a harness onto Rex and attached a short tow line, just enough for the dog to brace Evelyn on slick stretches without dragging her. Rex stood patient and proud, as if this was the job he'd been waiting for. Mason Hale stood on the porch with his radio and a flare pistol, scanning the sky like he could argue with weather. "Check in every 30 minutes, he repeated. "If you miss 2, "I know," Ethan said, and didn't let himself imagine the search. Walter adjusted the oxygen canister strap over his shoulder like it was a piece of gear, not a reminder that his heart was fragile. He tried to stand straighter than his body allowed. Pride, again. His last uniform. Evelyn touched Ethan's forearm before they stepped off. "You don't have to do this," she said, voice small. Ethan met her gaze and heard Marcus's last message in the back of his skull. Not as words, but as pressure. "Don't turn cold." "I do," Ethan said quietly. "Not just for him." They left the cabin behind like a lit island and entered the trees. The route didn't look like a route at first. It looked like wilderness, snow-laden branches, uneven slope, wind-carved pockets that could swallow a boot. But the old markings were there if you knew how to read them. A triangle carved into bark, a rock pile half buried, a strip of faded tape nailed to a post. Robert Crowe's handwriting had been a promise. His route was proof. Ethan moved point. Rex stayed close, checking ahead, then circling back to Evelyn whenever the ground iced over. Walter walked between them, one hand on his cane, the other occasionally pressing against his chest as if bargaining with it. At the first check-in, Ethan clicked the radio. "Hale, this is Crowe. We're on the line. Moving." Static, then Mason's voice. "Copy. Wind's picking up again. Keep it tight." They descended in careful stages. Ethan tested each step before he committed weight. He'd learned the hard way that you didn't trust ground. You couldn't see. Every few minutes he glanced down at his stopwatch, numbers marching forward with indifferent honesty. 15 minutes. 22. 29. The lull narrowed. Snow began to tilt again, pushing sideways. "Keep moving," Ethan said, voice calm, command-shaped. "Eyes on my footprints. Don't wander." Evelyn nodded, gripping the tow line lightly. Rex leaned into the harness at the worst spots, just enough pressure to steady her. The route bent around a slope marked ice shelf on the map. Ethan's stomach tightened. He could see it now, an angled plate of ice glazed over rock, slick as glass, dropping into trees below. One slip would turn into a fall you couldn't take back. He anchored the rope around a thick pine and stepped onto the ice, boots angled, weight low. He moved like he was crossing a ship's deck in heavy seas, controlled, deliberate, refusing to give the mountain a sudden motion to punish. Rex followed without hesitation. Evelyn came next, one hand on the rope, the other on Rex's harness line. Ethan guided her foot placement, quiet and precise. "Good," he murmured. "Just like that. Don't rush." Walter was last. His cane tapped the ice once and skittered. Ethan's breath stopped. Walter steadied, jaw clenched. "Walter," Evelyn whispered, fear cracking through her calm. Walter inhaled through pain and pride. "I'm still here." Ethan stepped back onto the shelf and took Walter's forearm. "No hero moves," he said. "We do this smart." Walter nodded once, then placed his boot exactly where Ethan pointed. Step. Another. The ice squealed under pressure. Ethan felt Walter's grip tighten like a vice. They made it across. Only then did Ethan let himself breathe. The second check-in came late. Ethan clicked the radio with gloved fingers. "Hail. Crossing shelf complete. Continuing descent." The reply was broken but present. "Copy. Good. Meet point ready." Ethan tucked the radio away and pushed on. The trees thinned as they dropped elevation. Wind eased again, and through a break in the pines the valley appeared. Distant roofs, a ribbon of road, smoke curling from chimneys like normal life was happening somewhere beyond the storm's reach. Evelyn stared, eyes shining. "We're close," she whispered. Walter tried to answer, then his body betrayed him. His hand jerked to his chest. His breath hitched. The cane fell from his fingers and sank into the snow like an abandoned flag. Walter's knees buckled. Ethan caught him before he hit the ground. "Walter!" Evelyn's voice snapped into panic. "His heart!" Ethan lowered Walter gently onto a flat patch of snow near a boulder that blocked some wind. Rex pressed close, whine low in his throat, eyes fixed on Walter's face. Ethan ripped off one glove and checked the pulse at Walter's neck. Faint, fading. Time narrowed to seconds. Ethan grabbed Walter's jacket and opened it, hands moving with brutal clarity. "Evelyn, look at me," he said, voice hard enough to cut through her terror. "You're going to keep him warm. Wrap the blanket around his shoulders and hold his head steady." Evelyn obeyed, shaking so badly her hands barely worked. "Walter, please, please." Ethan positioned his palms over the center of Walter's chest and began compressions. 1, 2, 3. Snow soaked through his knees. His arms burned. He counted anyway because counting kept fear from taking the wheel. Rex stayed inches away, body rigid, breathing fast, watching Ethan like a partner waiting for the next command. Ethan's mind flashed images he didn't want. A different man on a different ground, smoke, shouting, Marcus's voice breaking up in static. Ethan shoved it down and kept pushing. 30 compressions. Breathe check. Walter didn't respond. Ethan adjusted, deeper, more precise. He felt the ribcage give slightly and hated it, but didn't stop. Saving wasn't gentle. Saving was deciding you could live with what it cost. Evelyn sobbed, pressing her forehead to Walter's gloved hand. "Lord, please." Ethan did another cycle. Another. The stopwatch on his wrist kept running. Indifferent. Honest. Then Walter gasped. A ragged, ugly inhale, like his body had been dragged back into itself. His eyelids fluttered. His mouth opened and closed, searching for air. Ethan froze for half a heartbeat, then leaned close. "Stay with us," he whispered, voice trembling now. "Stay with me." Walter's eyes found Ethan's face, unfocused but present. A faint twitch pulled at the corner of his mouth. "Persistent. Kid?" he rasped, barely audible. Ethan laughed once, a broken sound. "You don't get to die on my route," he said. "Not after all this." They didn't move for several minutes. Ethan kept Walter reclined, monitoring his breathing, forcing his own hands to stop shaking. Evelyn stroked Walter's hair through his cap like she could smooth life back into him by touch alone. Rex pressed his shoulder against Evelyn's knee, steadying her without being asked. When Walter's pulse finally strengthened to something Ethan could trust for the next stretch, Ethan clicked the radio. Voice clipped. "Hail. We have a medical event. He's breathing again. We're moving slow. Prep the sled." Static, then Mason's voice, sharp with urgency. "Copy. Green flares are up. We see you when you clear the last tree line." Ethan looked at the valley again. It felt both close and impossibly far. He hauled Walter upright with Evelyn's help, then adjusted the oxygen canister. "Short steps," Ethan ordered. "Breathe. Don't argue." Walter's pride flared, but his body had spent it. He nodded once. They moved again. When the trees finally opened, the meet point looked like salvation. A clearing beside the ranger station road, where two figures in county gear stood by a rescue sled, and a green flare burned against the gray like a living promise. Evelyn's breath broke into a sob of relief. Mason Hale ran toward them, boots punching through slush. "You made it," he said, and his voice cracked, professional mask slipping for a second. Behind Mason, a young woman stood shaking, scarf pulled up to her eyes, tears already streaming. She saw Walter and Evelyn and made a sound that wasn't a word, just a release of fear turning into love. "Grandma!" she cried and sprinted forward. Evelyn opened her arms and caught her. The embrace was clumsy with winter coats and shaking hands, but it was real. It was warm. It was proof that the storm hadn't won. Walter sagged into the rescue sled, eyes half closed, breathing hard. He reached one trembling hand toward Ethan. Ethan took it. Walter squeezed with surprising strength. "You didn't just stop," he rasped. "You stayed." Ethan swallowed, throat thick. He looked down at his stopwatch, still running, then up at Rex, who stood beside him like a statue carved from loyalty. "I'm done driving past people," Ethan said quietly. Walter's eyes glimmered. "Good," he whispered. "World needs men who stop." Mason signaled the team, and they began moving Walter toward the waiting ambulance down the road. Evelyn turned back once, eyes shining through tears, and held Ethan's gaze like she was trying to memorize him. "You were the answer," she said softly. "Not to a miracle, to a prayer." Ethan didn't trust himself to speak. He only nodded. As the rescue team disappeared down the slushy road, the valley's distant church bell rang once, faint, wind-carried like the mountain finally acknowledging that mercy could echo too. Ethan stood in the clearing with Rex at his side, watching tire tracks cut through melting snow. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man running. He felt like a man who'd arrived. Spring came late to the San Juans, but it came. Snow peeled back from the pines. The old descent route stayed, marked, cleared, and ready. Ethan didn't leave the mountain again. He repaired the rescue shed, stocked it with fresh blankets and flares, and pinned a simple sign by the trailhead: Winter Mercy Route. Rex sat beside it like a living oath. Weeks later, Evelyn and Walter sent a photo, Lila between them, all three smiling, and Ethan's stopwatch finally felt like it belonged to the present. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs hope. Comment where you're watching from, and subscribe for more.